Mr. Secretary General, thank you for being with us again. We look forward to the conversation. Deborah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'd like to echo the thanks for giving us this time on such a busy day. Time is limited, so we'll get straight to business. Could you just tell us, what are you expecting from this summit? What will success look like?
I expect, and I'm also quite confident, that this summit will demonstrate unity. It will demonstrate the importance of Europe and North America standing together, and it will open a new chapter in our transatlantic relationship. But let me first of all thank the German Marshall Fund and Ian and you for organizing and for making this happening. This is a way for NATO to also reach out to a broader public and to share with them our thoughts and the decisions we're going to make during the day.
I mean, NATO has overcome challenges over the years, and in particular internal challenges. Like in 2019, you'll remember Emmanuel Macron of France questioning NATO's brain death. You've obviously had the turbulence of the Donald Trump years that NATO endured. We're looking forward to 2030. Can you just give us a sense of what you see the biggest threats that NATO will be facing in the next decade?
So I think what we have seen is that during the Cold War, it was one threat. That was the Soviet Union. That was in one way simple. It was not good, but it was a clear, defined threat, the Soviet Union. Now we live in an age of global competition. We live in a more unpredictable world where NATO has to face many different threats and challenges at the same time. Our core task, our main responsibility remains the same, and that is to defend and protect all allies, close to 1 billion people, and preserve peace. But the way we have to do that and the threats we are responding to, they have changed and they will continue to change. And that's the reason why we today will agree an ambitious, forward-looking agenda, the NATO 2030 agenda, which is about exactly how to continue to adapt NATO. It is about reinforcing our collective defense, it's about strengthening our resilience, it's about sharpening our technological edge, and it is for the first time for NATO to put climate and security as an important issue for our alliance and many other issues. The main message in that agenda is that as long as we are changing, adapting, then NATO will remain the most successful alliance in history.
It's really interesting about that whole impact on security of climate change. Like, what can NATO do to help mitigate that, and why is that so important?
So for NATO will never be the lead organization addressing all the aspects of climate change. But climate change is a crisis multiplier. Climate change will lead to more conflict over scarce resources like water, land. Millions of people will be forced to move, more migration. And that will exacerbate conflicts and lead to new conflicts. So therefore it matters for our security, and therefore it also matters for NATO. Fundamentally, there are three things that NATO has to do. First of all, we need to assess, to fully understand the link between climate change and security. Second, we need to adapt the way we conduct military operations and missions. Rising sea level will affect a lot of our naval bases. Heat waves, for instance, in Iraq, where we're operating, which we've already seen that, will affect the kind of uniforms, how we can operate, how our soldiers can do their work out in extreme weather conditions. Melting ice will change the strategic situation in the high north, and so on. So climate change will directly affect how we develop equipment, how we do exercises, our military planning, and all that. And thirdly, we need to contribute to the reduction of emissions. Most allies have now committed to the goal of net zero emissions of greenhouse gases. And then, of course, we also need to reduce emissions from military operations. So in adapting NATO, and what we will agree today is to also make sure that we include climate change in our military planning, in procurement when we develop new technology, so NATO is able to respond to the security challenges posed by climate change.
Will there be a timescale on that when NATO militaries can all be net zero in terms of their emissions?
We have not decided exactly now on when that will happen, but we have agreed that allies will first of all start to reduce their own missions, their military missions, and we will set goals for NATO missions and operations. But just the fact that this summit is making climate change an important issue is a huge step forward, and then we will follow up with a lot of work on how to implement the decisions leaders are taking today.
We've obviously seen NATO adapting the way that it interprets Article 5 in terms of what constitutes an armed attack to include cyber. What about space? Is space going to be considered an area that if, like, some sort of weapon zapped a satellite, that could be deemed an armed attack that could invoke an Article 5 response?
I think it is important that our Article 5, which states that an attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all, that we all will respond. That we have a consistent approach to that over all our domains. Air, sea, land, but also cyber and space. And we will make it clear at this summit that, of course, any attack on space capabilities like satellites and so on, or attacks from space could trigger Article 5. That's in a way just to clarify something which has been in many ways obvious for a long time. Because we have to be able to respond to any attack from any direction, also space and cyberspace, and that's the reason why we have made this consistent approach to Article 5 over the 5 domains which we now have: air, sea, land, space and cyberspace. That's
really interesting. Like obviously as well, another new part that we're seeing from the kind of language coming out of NATO, we're expecting to have a sharper language about China, about the challenges that China poses. Could you explain, like, why is that? Why is that deemed necessary? Obviously, it's going to be balanced against sort of the opportunities and the need to engage. But isn't there a concern that if NATO does sharpen its language, it could actually antagonise a rival, a competitor, and potentially raise the prospect of conflict?
China is not our adversary, and we need to engage with China on important issues as climate change, or for instance the situation in Afghanistan, or arms control and other issues. At the same time, the global balance of power is shifting with the rise of China. And we have seen a coercive behavior by China, not least in the South China Sea. We have seen and we see that they are investing heavily in new modern military capabilities, nuclear capabilities, long-range missile systems, submarines. China already has the second largest defense budget in the world. They already have the largest navy in the world. And they don't share our values. They are cracking down on democratic protest in Hong Kong, persecuting Uyghurs and other minorities in their own country. So the rise of China poses challenges for NATO allies, and we need to respond to that together as an alliance. The interesting thing is that, in the strategic concept we agreed for NATO in 2010, which is the current strategic concept, China is not mentioned with a single word. The first time heads of state and government in NATO addressed China at all was at our summit in December in London in 2019, so 18 months ago. That's the first time. At this summit, leaders will formulate a common position on China, also taking into account that we need to stand together also when it comes to responding to the security consequences of the rise of China.
So obviously you don't see China as a threat, but Russia clearly still seen as a significant threat by NATO. We know that after this summit, the first summit that President Joe Biden is going to be attending, he'll be off to meet his Russian counterpart in Switzerland, Vladimir Putin. What are you hoping that the US president will, in terms of a message, deliver to President Putin from the perspective of NATO?
So I welcome the fact that President Biden will meet in a couple of hours all the other NATO leaders here in Brussels at the NATO Summit. and I'm also sure that the other leaders will welcome the opportunity to consult with President Biden ahead of his meeting with President Putin, because NATO has been a platform for coordination and consultations on our relationship with Russia, and especially on arms control. And the meeting that President Biden will have with President Putin is full in line with NATO's dual-track approach: deterrence, defense, and dialogue. Dialogue is not a sign of weakness. We need to talk to Russia, it's our neighbor, partly to strive for a better relationship, but even without a better relationship in the foreseeable future, we need to manage a difficult relationship with Russia on risk reduction, transparency to prevent incidents and accidents when we have now more military presence along our borders, but also, of course, to address the important issue of arms control. We welcome the decision by Russia, and the United States and Russia, to extend the New START agreement that limits the number of long-range nuclear weapons. But this should only be the first step, and therefore we also hope that the two presidents can make some progress on issues related to arms control, because we don't want a new arms race, and we want to expand and strengthen the arms control agenda and include more weapon systems, and at some stage also include China in global arms control.
But if you look at the pattern of Russia's behaviour over the last few years, I mean, even recently with the build-up of Russian forces on Ukraine's border, allegations of meddling in democratic elections, cyber attacks, the fact that Belarus's president who is backed by Putin, felt able to force that Ryanair flight down and to take a journalist off the flight. Isn't it the case that despite all the rhetoric, all the language and all the transformation that NATO has done since 2014, that deterrence just isn't working?
What we see is our aggressive actions of Russia, and this is part of a pattern we have seen over many years. At the same time, NATO has responded in a very firm way. After the illegal annexation of Crimea, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation. For the first time in our history, we have combat-ready battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, in the Baltic countries, Poland. We have more air policing, more naval presence, and most importantly, we have 7 consecutive years of increased defense spending across Europe and Canada. So that's a very strong message to Russia, that we are there to defend and protect all allies, not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict, to preserve the peace. So to prevent that anything that, like what we have seen against Ukraine or Georgia, will never happen against a NATO ally. So deterrence works. No NATO ally has been subject to an armed attack, and that's not. And we have been able to preserve peace for NATO allies. Then the challenge is that we now see different forms of aggression through cyberspace, hybrid attacks, and that's the reason why we need to adapt and change the way we work together in NATO, including on strengthening our cyber defenses, resilience, technology, and all the other issues which we are addressing as part of NATO 2030.
Now, I know you don't normally like talking about individual NATO states, but it would be remiss of me not to ask about how the change in personnel at the White House is impacting NATO, the ability of NATO to act. What's it like having Joe Biden to deal with instead of Donald Trump?
I had the privilege to meet President Biden in the White House last Monday, a week ago, and it was great to see his strong personal and powerful commitment to NATO. He knows NATO very well, and he really believes in the idea of North America and Europe working together in NATO. So therefore it will be great also to welcome him now soon to the NATO Summit here in Brussels. Then I think that, of course, there's no way to hide that over the last years we had some challenging discussions among allies. But I think that the main lesson learned is that NATO as an institution as a multilateral alliance goes beyond individual political leaders. NATO can weather different political winds, and we will do that again. Because it is in the national security interest of each and every ally to stand together. So yes, there are different leaders, they have different opinions, sometimes they disagree, but we always are able to unite around our core task, that we are safer together than alone. And that's even more important now when we have a more competitive world. And let me add that one thing that also reinforces this message is that when you look at the opinion polls, they go a bit up and down, but the main message in all NATO allied countries is that it's strong public support to NATO, and that includes the United States. There is very strong public support to NATO, US NATO membership, and very strong bipartisan support for NATO. So yes, there were some differences, there will be differences in the future, but as long as we make sure that NATO continue to adapt as we do in the meeting today, I'm absolutely confident that NATO will remain the cornerstone for our collective defense for Europe and North America.
And do you think even that, that Donald Trump was actually good for NATO, because it kind of gave everyone a bit of a kick and maybe kicked complacency out of certain European countries to not take the US for granted?
He had the direct style. At the same time, I think that the lesson is the importance of organizing our partnership through institutions that is not dependent on specific individuals for good or for bad. Then I also think that what we have seen is that NATO allies have stepped up, both investing more and doing more together. But that's a trend we have seen over the last years.
I mean, just sort of on the money front, which is obviously important, like this agenda that NATO is going to be agreeing is ambitious. But as we've seen, like, transformation comes at a price. And you've been a strong advocate of the NATO Common Fund. But I've been told by a number of sources that in the run-up to this summit, there was some pushback on the idea of increasing the NATO Common Fund by France in particular, opposing worried really that potentially if you increase that common fund it could detract from EU defence. Are you able to say anything about that or about the importance of the common funding for NATO?
First of all, the most important thing is that today NATO leaders will agree a wide range of concrete measures on how to strengthen NATO. On technology, on resilience, on collective defense, on working more closely with partners, on climate change, and also on how to train partners so we help to stabilize our neighborhood. This is the ambitious, forward-looking NATO 2030 agenda. We will agree that with a higher ambition for our alliance. And there's no way we can do more and set higher ambitions without the necessary funding. Therefore, we need to continue to invest, and we are on a good track with 7 consecutive years of increased defense spending across Europe and Canada. But we also should invest more together, and I'm confident that leaders today will agree that we should match this higher level of ambition with increased investment in NATO's budgets, including by adding funding for a wide range of activities which are important for our security. More readiness, more exercises, command and control, pre-positioned equipment, training partners, and so on. Of course, there are always discussions when we discuss resources and budgets. That's the case in every institution, in every government, in every international organization. We have had a process, and the original proposal was only to increase the military budget, one of NATO's 3 common funded budgets. Today, I'm confident that allied leaders will agree to increase not only 1, but 3 budgets. The civil budget, the military budget, and the budget for infrastructure. And by increasing all 3 budgets and adding fund to all 3 of them, we will be able to do even more. So I welcome that at the end of the day we'll have a very good decision on the ambitions, on what we want to do together, but also the need to properly fund and resource this higher level of ambition across all the 3 NATO budgets.
And obviously leaders are thinking about the future and adapting for the future, but right now NATO troops are withdrawing from Afghanistan, a long operation, nearly 20 years now. Is it a matter of regret for you that NATO forces are leaving Afghanistan as violence is growing once again, the Taliban is on the rise, the chance of a peace process looks increasingly unlikely?
We have been, and I have been, honest and clear-eyed about the risks that the decision to end our military presence in Afghanistan entails for the future of Afghanistan. That was not an easy decision. Let me also, pay tribute to all those who have served and also to those who have paid the ultimate price in our mission in Afghanistan over almost 2 decades. Then the intention was never to stay in Afghanistan forever. We have gradually moved from a combat operation of more than 100,000 troops. At the beginning of this year, we were around 10,000 NATO troops, and this year we will end our research support mission, our military operation in Afghanistan. But as we wind down our military mission, we will continue to provide support to the Afghans with funding for the Afghan security forces. That's absolutely critical. With a continued civilian presence to provide capacity building advice. We are looking into how we can provide out-of-country training for the Afghan security forces and especially the special operation forces. And we're also working with all the NATO allies on how we can maintain some critical infrastructure, especially the international airport in Kabul. So yes, we are ending our military mission, but no, we are not ending our support for the Afghans. We realize that there are risks, but at some stage the Afghan has had to take over the responsibility and be fully responsible for their own future. This was not an easy decision, and I know that some allies also had different views as we consulted and discussed. But we had thorough consultations after the Biden administration started their deliberations on the future presence in Afghanistan. We have actually had 6 meetings of the North Atlantic Council. We have had 3 ministerial meetings and a number of bilateral meetings, phone calls and so on, also meetings in Kabul, where we have consulted closely before we made the final decision, and now we are united in ending the mission in a responsible way, but at the same time continue to provide support to the Afghans.
But is it not just a matter of regret for you personally? I mean, the fact is, yes, support might be continuing in different ways, but all that blood, all that treasure, and yet we're leaving it, NATO is leaving behind a very unstable situation and, dangers for the Afghan population.
But there is no risk-free way in Afghanistan. We could either end the mission as we do now and then continue to provide support in other ways, funding, out-of-country training, advice, civilian presence. And that road or that path entails risks, no doubt about that. And there is a very difficult and fragile the very difficult situation in Afghanistan. But the alternative to stay was also an option that entailed risks for more violence, more casualties, and even perhaps the need to increase the number of NATO troops. Because, as I said, we have gone from more than 100,000 to 10,000. And the whole plan has all the way been to enable the Afghans to take care of their own security.
So is it a failed plan in that sense?
Well, when we arrived, there were hardly any Afghan security forces at all. Now we have well-trained, well-equipped Afghan security force of around 300,000 personnel. That's no guarantee for success, but at least it's a very different Afghanistan, and the Afghans are much more capable of taking care of their own security now with 300,000 trained security personnel compared to where they were before we came, or back in 2001, 2002. And then the main reason for us to go into Afghanistan, of course, to fight international terrorism, to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. But of course, by being there, we also help to promote social and economic progress, and we will continue to provide support, but in other ways, to try to preserve those hard-won gains.
I'm going to switch some questions from our audience now. And unfortunately, I don't have the names of the people asking these questions, so I'll just sort of read them out. The first one is, they want to know how you see the role of NATO, and it kind of follows on from what we're talking about in Afghanistan, but how do you see the role of NATO in the process of countries that are recovering from conflict, with Syria and Libya the first among many?
Well, it depends, of course, which kind of countries we talk about. But in general, I believe that NATO has an untapped potential, and that we can do more when it comes to train local forces, build local capacity. The idea is that prevention is better than intervention. We should do whatever we can to prevent situations where we are forced into big military combat operations. As was the case in Afghanistan, that's one of the reasons why we have been so focused on building local Afghan security forces, so they can take over more and more of the responsibility. That's the reason why we are now training Iraqi security forces and stepping up in Afghanistan when it comes to training capacity building to enable them to stabilize their own country. And that's also the reason why NATO were part of NATO allies, as we are all, NATO and NATO allies are part of the global coalition to defeat Daesh. That was originally a very big combat operation. And of course, sometimes we are forced to go into that kind of big combat operation, as we did as the global coalition in Iraq and Syria. Our focus now, as we have wound down the combat operations in the global coalition, is to then build up capacity building. And again, one of the 8 proposals we will, or measures we will agree as part of NATO 2030, and one of the reasons to also invest more together in NATO common funded budgets is that will enable us to train more local forces, build more local capacity, and thereby stabilize our neighborhood.
So there's a couple of questions dealing with Russian activity in the Black Sea over the last few years and currently. And one person asks in particular, what additional steps do you see NATO taking to increase stability in the Black Sea and also across the Balkans?
Well, NATO has been and still is absolutely very much present in the Western Balkans. First of all, we have new members from that region. Over the last few years, we have demonstrated that NATO's door is open with getting new members like North Macedonia and Montenegro. That's important, but we also work with partners in the region, and we have still the KFOR mission in Kosovo. So we are present, we have a history, and we have a responsibility to continue to help stabilize the region. In the Black Sea, we have increased our presence. 3 of the littoral states in the Black Sea are NATO members: Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. We have more air policing, we have more naval presence, we have more exercises. And again, the NATO 2030 agenda is also about how can we invest more in deterrence and defense activities, including in the Black Sea region. And then we have 2 very important partners, Georgia and Ukraine. And we are stepping up the cooperation with them, including helping Ukraine with developing their naval capabilities. I visited Odessa some time ago, and I saw how NATO trainers help to educate Ukrainian cadets and naval personnel. and we're also working with Georgia on Black Sea security.
Actually, on Georgia, there's a question here saying that we've heard many times that NATO's doors are open to Georgia. When exactly will this door open, and can Georgia expect a roadmap in the nearest future?
I expect that NATO allies today will recommit, confirm the decisions we have taken before, not least at the Bucharest Summit, where we stated clearly that Georgia will become a member, but we didn't provide any dates, and we will not provide any dates today either. Our focus is on reform. Our focus is to continue to support Georgia in modernizing their defense and security institutions. And the message is that, of course, NATO's door is open. We have demonstrated that over the last couple of years with Montenegro and North Macedonia joining. The other message is that it's only for the aspirant country, Georgia, and the 30 allies to decide on enlargement of our alliance. Russia has no right to interfere in that process. It's a sovereign right of any country to decide its own path, including what kind of security arrangements it wants to be part of.
There's a really interesting question here. It says, NATO's comprehensive political guidance endorsed in the 2006 Riga Summit, I'm sure you know all about that, having swatted up, noted that the spread of WMD, so weapons of mass destruction, and the possibility that terrorists will acquire WMD as the principal threat to the alliance over the next 10 to 15 years. So given that we're now past that, how do you assess the situation today?
That's still a challenge. The proliferation of nuclear weapons, either to states or to terrorist organizations, is one of the many threats and challenges we face in a more unpredictable world. And that's exactly also why we need to strengthen NATO in so many different ways at the same time, delivering our core task, but addressing many more threats than we did many years ago during the Cold War.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I'd like to ask you many more questions, but we can't get through them all this morning. But thank you ever so much for speaking to us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.